Okay, well, it looks like people are pouring in. Thank you for welcoming folks, Clarin. I'll add my own welcome to everyone who's now coming in, attendees. And I have to admit, this is a little bit of a different experience for me because I'm used to being able to see more of the participants. But just welcome, and I think we'll get started because we've got a great topic, and I'm hoping our panelists will have a lot to say. And so I want to make sure that we make the best use of our just an hour today. So welcome. So the topic of our panel today is Back to the Future of Educational Research. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Betty G., currently an Associate Dean at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University, and I'll be the facilitator of our panel discussion today. This is a session that's one of an ongoing weekly series of conversations that we've been holding in the college since last fall for Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College faculty and students on a wide range of topics that are relevant to academic life. And what's different today is that today's session is also part of the Learning Planet Festival, which is a 5-day event that started with the celebration of the International Day of Education on January 24th at the beginning of this week. And it's included just an amazing array of, I think, more than 500 online and on-site events all around the world, including a number of events here at the ASU Tempe campus. And I just wanted to thank Iveta Silova, one of our panelists today, for helping us include this session in the festival program. And I welcome all of you who are joining us today from outside of ASU. So now to the topic of our session today. The title was inspired by the 2020 OECD report called Back to the Future of Education, that called for newer and broader conceptions of possible futures for education. A second UNESCO report released the following year was titled Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. And in that report, the authors described our current and future world as one of increasing complexity, uncertainty, and precarity. Reflected in challenges such as the recent COVID pandemic, the rise of AI, which has been getting a lot of press and attention in the media recently, and a host of other things that seem to be really radically changing the conditions in which we're living and conditions for education. In this context, the report argued education must, and in some cases will be forced to, increasingly transform, and sometimes in unpredictable ways. So here we turn our attention to educational research and what these kinds of challenges mean for the future of educational research. So for this panel today, we've invited 4 academics, all associated with Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. Each of our panelists bring varied perspectives to this question. And I think one of our assumptions is that we need a real diversity of perspectives, excuse me, to take on the challenges that we may be facing. Our panelists include Iveta Silova. She's professor and associate dean for global engagement at Teachers College. Ruth Wylie, who's an associate research professor and assistant director for the ASU Center for Science and the Imagination. Karen Harris, who is a Regents professor emeritus, who's had a very distinguished career, particularly in the area of educational psychology. And David Berliner, who's also a Regents professor emeritus. I think you got your start in ed psychology, David, although
Correct.
I think you're more recently known for your educational policy work. So we've asked the panelists to productively speculate what the future of educational research can and should be if seen from about 50 years in the future. I'm going to ask each panelist to speak for about 7 minutes in response to more specific questions. And then we hope to have time for additional questions and discussion among all the participants. So please, as our panelists are speaking, post your questions in, and Clarin, we have a Q&A where questions should go. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yes. So please post your questions there so that we have a record of them and we can use them for a discussion after the panelists give their opening comments. So with that, I'm going to turn first to David, and I'm going to actually, I'll post this too in the chat so everyone can see. But David, what I'd like you to do is respond. Let me start by saying you have a perspective informed by a long and very active scholarly career. So I'd like you to identify just one or two of the most significant changes in educational research that you've observed over your career. And then given your perspective, what do you anticipate will be of some future developments in educational research over the next 50 years? Just an easy question.
An easy task. Well, looking back is easier. And I have actually three comments on looking back. One is that we went from concern about majority kids primarily to concern about all kids, caring to know more about gender, race, social class, and the kinds of differences that those cause in our research studies. That's nothing but good for, I think, our society. But of course, it complexifies everything. It means things are not necessarily as generalizable. So yes, it's good. And yes, it's a bit of a problem in terms of trying to find generalizability ideas. A second big change, I thought, was a change from domination by experimental studies to domination, maybe, or certainly equality with by qualitative studies. And what we found along the way was that the experimental studies were not nearly as generalizable as we thought, and qualitative studies don't even propose that they're generalizable. They're site-specific, classroom-specific, teacher-specific, etc. So what we've gone from a quest for generalizable knowledge in educational research to much more modest beliefs that we're going to have very site-specific, teacher-specific, classroom-specific kinds of knowledge. That's a huge change, and it's quite different than physics or chemistry or any of the other sciences. Doesn't make us less of a science. As I've written once, this is the most complex science of them all, in a way. And the third point is that as a function of this change, more of our classroom research just is not generalizable. I already said that. We should think of educational research more as a site-specific kind of research, and not even try to compare us to physics or biology. When I first started out, everyone was trying to be more like a physicist. Well, that was a stupid ambition because classrooms are much more complex than what physics people work with. Because when they find something, it holds. When we find something, it might hold for a week. It's a whole different attitude about the generalizability of our research. So those are the changes. On the 50 years from now, I'm not sure I'm any good at this, but I think it's pretty clear to me we're going to go to really intelligent tutoring in the future. From Skinner's 1940 teaching machines, after World War II, he had kind of invented the teaching machine. Into the year 2030, let's say, we'll have intelligent tutoring, and it'll be a 90-year change from the teacher as instructor, I think, to the teacher as instructional counselors with machines doing a lot of the instruction. So that's part of what it looks like to me. And the other part is a sad note. If present undemocratic trends continue, not just in our country, but in a number of democracies, we'll see public education decline and private religion education increase. And that adds additional tensions to our democracy in ways that I don't think we quite understand yet, because we've had from Horace Mann in the 1830s and 40s on, we've had this incredible belief that public education could solve our problems. That's not been true. It hasn't happened, but the belief has been there that public education and our democracy are linked. And what we're getting is a whole bunch of people breaking off those linkages. And if you do that, the question is whether our democracy as we know it can stand. And that's a scary issue that takes us out of education more into political science and that sort of thing. So those are comments to start us off.
Those are great comments, David, very provocative. So I'm actually interested in the participants' response as well as some of the other panelists. But first, let's move on. Karen, we're posing the same question or questions to you. What are 1 to 2 of the most significant changes in educational research that you've observed over your career? And given your perspective, what do you anticipate will be some future developments in educational research over the next 50 years? And you're muted, Karen. So
I recently reached 50 years in education, so this question was a good one to stop and think about. First of all, I agree with everything David said, so I'll just try to give a couple of thoughts here. David mentioned the increasing complexity of our research, and for me, one of the good things that I have a love-hate relationship with has been the move toward inclusive classrooms. And yet we have lots of data that a lot of children, particularly children with severe emotional behavior disorders and children with severe learning disabilities, are not having their needs met in these inclusive classrooms. And so I hope that will change, and that'll come to one of my 3 points. But it seems like something to celebrate, but sometimes we put things in the name of equity and social justice into place that aren't necessarily achieving those goals. So I think we need to be more nuanced and thoughtful about that. I agree that technology will play a large role. I believe in teacher-led instruction, however, with teachers leading and technology supporting. So we've been researching for about a decade. My work is mostly in learning to write in substantive text across grades 1 through 12, across the 3 big genres. And I created an instructional model called Self-Regulated Strategy Development, SRSD. And it is now being used in about 12 countries. It's What Works Clearinghouse deemed evidence-based, and 4 other groups the same. There are now about 200 studies of it. And one of the things that's so important is that we keep looking at, and we can do better, but we're not doing enough of it. We keep looking at how the whole class moves, but we don't do enough of what special ed calls, and we can argue labels all day. I'm not going to do word wars. Special ed calls non-responders. Other groups called, not targeted. We've moved into this, everyone counts, but we're not doing a good job of actually making that happen in our work. And we have more intervention research by more people in more fields. So those will be the things that I think have been important developments. And then to go on to the things about the future. I mean, interestingly, and I'll throw the reference in the chat for anyone who wants to actually look it up, but I published a paper in Journal of Ed Psych about 3 years ago on this topic. I had to title it The Future of Ed Psych because it was for a special section, but I went rogue and it's about the future of education. And I wrote it from the perspective of someone, it's called a future retrospective, and I wrote it from the perspective of someone at some undesignated time in the future. But in fact, 40 to 50 years was kind of what I had in mind. I mean, the sad part of what I wrote is that based on how slow education is and our culture have been to change, we've made progress by the time of this future retrospective, but not quite everywhere we'd like to be. I think one of the biggest things that's coming and could help us a lot with every issue David addressed and I concurred with is complexity science. I'm so excited with Joanna Warner. We are doing a special issue of the International Journal of Complexity Science, focusing on complexity science in education. Complexity science has been highly significant in addressing huge problems like poverty, hunger, income. It is big and it can make a difference. It's extremely expensive, and education, if they don't pony up, will never get really good at this form of research. It goes beyond mixed methods, and I can't teach you all of what it is. Some of you who are here may have attended the online webinar that I hosted with 3 specialists in complexity science in education. It does mean giving up paradigm wars. I mean, David, I'm sure the same, and many of you, I'm sick to death of them. My football team is better than your football team. I mean, insert something people are passionate about. It's ludicrous. We have proven over and over again, not just SRSD, but now there are multiple instructional methods firmly anchored in multiple theories, which SRSD that began in the 80s and has progressed and continues to be refined until today. And they're better, they're stronger. SRSD blows out of the water whole language reading and writing. It blows out of the water curriculum-based reading and writing for all published curriculums, and on and on and on. It blows out the writing revolution. It just Calkins, none of them are reaching what our kids are reaching. Okay, so we need to get into this. And our second thing, I just don't see how we're going to get where we can get if our culture doesn't, our culture, the US, but larger than the US, worldwide, we don't come to an outstandingly strong belief that every child deserves a high quality education. You know, I still get teachers, writer's workshop teacher recently said to me, well, we do everything right. And if a kid doesn't thrive in this classroom, there's something wrong with the kid. And if you've listened to the podcast Sold a Story, you'll find that many teachers express that viewpoint. She talks about it and interviews quite a few teachers. And this just isn't working. It means we're leaving all these kids behind. And since most of my work has been focused in high poverty, underserved schools, where people care and they're trying, and I've worked with parents too, and they want so much for these kids, but they don't have access to what it takes. So until we'll pay for it, we have to believe in it, and we have to be willing to pay for it. We could pay for it now in this country, but we're not willing, and not everyone wants it. Real quickly, I think we have to quit recreating the wheel. I am so sick and tired of seeing the same broad concept come up in yet another label, spark a whole new body of research, and don't look at any of the research already done here. I think one of the areas that bugs me the most is transfer of learning or generalization of learning. Too many people have been taught to hate behavioral science. There is a lot there that is good. There is a lot there that we have not done better than, and generalization, that is one of their strongest areas. Way back to Don Bear, quit hoping and praying. We have to develop, teach for generalization. And yet people keep telling me, oh, generalization, you just can't get it. And that's just nonsense. But in addition, grit, mindset, all of these things, you can go back, and certainly the grit one has now been researched to death to show how it overlaps with motivation. But you can go back and trace these. Can we make them better? Yes, but too many young research. I just asked the other day, in an online session, have any of you heard of Jerome Bruner? Not one. Barbara Keogh, not one. Michael Presley, who we only lost, much more recently, not one. If that doesn't stop, we're just going to recreate the wheel forever. And then finally, we need more emphasis to help that happen on educational historians. And educational historians already do great work, but I see very little of educational historians tracking theories and their outcomes and how they relate to other theories. And until we value that work, it's going to be hard to accomplish it. So I'm done.
Thanks so much, Karen. I appreciate your passion as well as the additional points that you've raised. Again, very provocative, and I think a huge concern for those of us who have been in education for a while is, why aren't we better at understanding why education is so resistant to change? I mean, the report that I mentioned, was talking about the likelihood that education would change, yet there's many of us who think that it actually hasn't changed enough. But now we're switching gears a bit to a different sort of question for our last two panelists. So the questions that we're going to pose, and I think I will ask Iveta to speak first. But before I do, I just wanted to note, I'm posting these questions in chat. I see that someone said our chat was disabled for participants, but you should be able to post questions in the Q&A. So again, I encourage you to do that. I see one question already that we'll get to as we move forward after the panelists, but please feel free to post comments and questions there. So starting with Iveta, and this is a general introduction for both Iveta and Ruth. Each of you have been working in areas and on topics that actually may not have even existed in educational research 50 years ago. And both of you also emphasize interdisciplinary collaborations in your scholarship. So using that theme or these themes as a starting point, how might the nature of interdisciplinary collaborations in educational research continue to develop or potentially change over the next 50 years? And again, Iveta, would you reply first?
I'll start. Thank you so much, Betty. And thank you for these great questions. I'm looking forward to hearing from others as well. So I surely hope that there is much more interdisciplinary collaboration in the future, because we urgently need it. I think it's more and more clear every day that any single discipline alone just does not have enough to solve all of the huge challenges that we are facing. And so we cannot be siloed anymore, theoretically, across disciplines, across topics, across geopolitical areas, that we just cannot afford to do that anymore. We think we are running out of time. And so I will place my discussion maybe in the context of the Anthropocene, education in the Anthropocene, the age of men, a time in which humans, and perhaps I should say some humans, have fundamentally altered the planet's geo and biospheric systems, triggering a cascade of ecological crises and threatening the future of life on Earth as we have known it, including that of our own species. And COVID-19 is just a glimpse into much more devastating and regular human-induced environmental crises we will be experiencing. David Orr and others have been recently trying also to put this crisis of the Anthropocene or climate crisis also in conversation with the crisis of democracies that we are facing, and basically saying how both are really exacerbating each other and both have to be solved simultaneously and at the same time. And at the core of these solutions, I think many of us see education. But maybe linking back to also David Berlina's comments, I actually also think that education is very deeply implicated in these crises that we are facing, and also in our failure to imagine alternatives and alternative futures. And despite many of the efforts to promote education as key to achieving sustainable lives, so quality education, we see schools and higher education systems continuing to prioritize workforce supplies for economic growth over environmental sustainability, individualism and competitiveness over interdependence and collaboration and caring ethics. And so these Cartesian dualisms that structure our curriculum and pedagogies are instrumental in perpetuating our delusions that we are somehow separate from the world around us, and that we can act upon it with impunity. And so I am inspired in my work by the words of Val Plumwood, the Australian environmental philosopher, who warned us about a decade ago. She said that, and I quote her, "If our species does not survive the ecological crisis, it will probably be due to our failure to imagine and work out new ways to live with the earth. And she says we will go onwards in a different mode of humanity or not at all. And like Plumwood, I do believe that the current crises we face are very indicative, first and foremost, also of our failure to imagine alternative ways of living with the earth and alternative ways of educations that help us to live differently with the earth and with each other. And so this question is, how do we then cultivate this ecological imagination that may help us to rethink our approaches to education and our relationship with the earth? But this radical reimagination of education is so difficult because this current dominant model of education is so deeply ingrained in our minds and it's institutionalized within our systems. So I find it's so difficult to actually approach the radical critique and radical reimagination of the current system. And so in my work, I have been working with colleagues to create some spaces and experiment with some approaches where we can begin such reimagination. And I wanted to share as one of the examples very quickly a work that I have done with the Common Worlds Research Collective and its founding members, Afrika Taylor, Veronica Passini-Quechaba, and Mindy Blaze, where we kind of try to reimagine education, actually also, Karen, very similarly from the perspective from 50 years ahead of us. So we wrote it from the perspective of 2050 and with the idea really wanting our readers to imagine what we need to do today to be in a place by 2050, right? So the setting is unique. And this whole writing process actually was so exciting and refreshing because normally we don't do such speculative writing. And we used speculative fabulation, kind of a form of SF genre that broadly includes science fiction, science fact, science fantasy, situated feminism, speculative futures, and much more, but very grounded also in what we are doing right now. And so in this work, we're inspired by work of Isabel Stenger, Jonah Haraway, Val Plumwood, and other feminist philosophers who use this SF genre as a means of developing very specific mode of attention that gives rise to the possibilities in the making, not only questioning the authoritative distribution between what is possible and what is impossible in the current context, or what is acceptable or unacceptable, but also develops the capacity to see, imagine, and articulate viable alternatives to the current status quo. Because such thought experiments are largely missing in the field of education, we thought it was a great opportunity to try and play with these ideas and bring attention to what may be possible in education. So writing from the perspective of 2050 about today's education context also allows us to experiment with the notion of time, because it disrupts this linear progression of time and it brings the future much closer to the present. And this really highlights the urgency of taking actions now, right? So it's much harder to just go away and not think about our own role in this future that is already here. And so it demands immediate attention and immediate action. And so we wrote this paper as a series of provocation to spur the discussion and action, but ultimately it's kind of based on three assumptions. One, that human and planetary sustainability is one and the same thing, and we are inseparable part of the ecosystems which we have destabilized and which now threaten life on Earth. And second, that any attempt to achieve sustainable futures by continuing to separate humans off from the rest of the world, which we do through education so insistently, is delusional and futile, even if the intentions are well-meaning. And third, that education must play a very central role in radically reconfiguring the ways in which we think about our place and agency in this interdependent world and also how we act. So this requires a complete paradigm shift in education from learning about the world in order to act upon it and change it, to learning to become with the world around us and learn with nature, with other species, with AI, instead of controlling and managing all the whole world around us. And so thinking about the future of education, in this paper, we argue that our future survival really depends on our capacity to make this shift. And I'll maybe stop here, and I'll also share this paper in case somebody wants to check it out, and in hopes to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, Iveta. Yeah, I was going to ask you and any of the other panelists to please put into chat some of the references that you're mentioning. But yeah, I love it. I was actually starting to think of it as you were talking about what David was saying about the progression of research over the course of his career. And you're talking about a whole different way of configuring what our role is as, it's not even researchers in the same way as provocateurs or futurist thinkers or something along those lines. But I think what your comments are a really good segue then into what I can imagine Ruth might wish to comment on, and just noting that Ruth has spent a considerable amount of time over the past number of years in her work as assistant director of ASU Center for the Science and Imagination on addressing some of these ways that imagination, among other things, can be a way for us to envision different futures. So Ruth, your comments next.
Thank you. And again, just so hard to go after the three of you. It's I've been jotting down more notes than thinking about what I'm going to say, but I think that there's a lot of resonance here. So as Betty mentioned, I work at the Center for Science and the Imagination, and our mission is to ignite the collective imagination for a better future. So we do this through lots of different wildly interdisciplinary projects. We bring together science fiction authors, graphic artists, poets, experts in a number of different disciplines to collectively imagine what the future might be. We do this for a number of different disciplines, but one thing that I keep going back to in all of these projects, if we're going to actually enact any of these future visions, which is of course the goal, the imagining is fun and it's inspiring, but we want to actually see change, that education is the method that we're going to get there. None of these things are going to happen. We're not going to envision NASA space futures without changing how we think about educating our STEM workforce. And so all of these ideas about how do we change the future, how do we shape the future? I actually like the word build or shape the future more than change the future, because change the future suggests that it's something already there. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. The idea that the future is somebody else's problem or it's already been figured out. But really, and I think this is echoed in what Iveta is saying, it is collectively our responsibility to build that future or futures, and what do we want to see? And of course, education is going to play such a critical and important role in that. And I was reflecting on this 50-year time span that we were inspired by, and doing a little bit of very light digging about where we were about 40 or 50 years ago, and particularly around technology, because we also, a theme that I've heard already today is about how we know that technology is going to shape things. And also my background being in computer science and learning science, it's a space I felt comfortable talking about. But I learned that the research community of CSCL, so computer supportive collaborative learning, that the first conference on the theme, they didn't have the acronym yet, but the first conference on the theme was about 40 years ago in 1983. And it wasn't until 3 years after that that the term was introduced. And then the first conference was in 1995. And I think that it gives an idea of sometimes how quickly we move in research, but also sometimes how slowly we move in research. And I think that it's really important to reflect on these timelines and to reflect on why we move at these certain paces. And I think a lot of it is around the reward structure, that we tend to reward more safer increments, or we're scared of asking big, daring questions. And sometimes that makes sense in education, because if we take a really risky proposition and we have a group of kindergartners and we're trying something incredibly new for their 13 years of school, if we fail at that, that's a problem, and so it does make sense on one hand about why we don't see these radical changes, but I don't think that we can take that fear as an excuse for not trying new things and not trying to think boldly about it. And I was really thinking also about how not just might educational research, interdisciplinary educational research change in the next 50 years, but how should it? And I think one of the really important pieces, again, echoed by folks already today, is that we need to be better at communicating. I think that we are pretty good at communicating to people in our spheres, in our communities. But I think Karen, you were mentioning about seeing the wheel being reinvented over and over. Like, why is that happening? Or people not knowing about these incredible scholars and their work? Because we're not communicating that well enough. And again, I think that education is fundamentally about communication. So how do we not only communicate to future generations of scholars, but also how do we communicate to all of the stakeholders in education? So how do we communicate to policymakers? How do we communicate to classroom teachers and folks at districts and learners and parents? Because I think that if we can start to address some of that, as academics and scholars, we're given the privilege to really study some really interesting phenomena. And I think with that comes the responsibility to make sure that those messages are communicated beyond just a scholarly group. And so I think that if I were to put a wish for the next 50 years, it's that communication, one, is valued. So we are valuing it as an academic group, as a scholarly group, but that we're also being inspired by what we're hearing from people in classrooms and work. And I know that a lot of people are already doing this work, but I'd like to see it even more, so that we're communicating to folks, but we're also listening and not just talking all the time. And I think that is a good sign for me to stop talking and go to some of the questions perhaps, or hear some responses.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And yes, in the interest of responding to some questions, let me see if I can paraphrase. We just have a few, and I will also add, everyone should be able to post in chat as well. So if you're would like to post in chat rather than Q&A, feel free to do that too. So one of the comments or questions from Taylor asks, or comments on the disconnect between research and actual change in education, which I think has been a theme throughout some of your comments, and certainly something that many people have observed over the years. And Ruth, I think maybe you started to touch on this by talking about communication, but what is this problem? I mean, part of me wonders if we're not conceptualizing this pipeline in the right way. But those of you who are on the panel, how do you respond to this question? And there's a second part of it, which is, how might we adjust institutionalized systems to be more responsive, adaptable to changing needs, which I think relates in some ways to why aren't things changing in response to educational research? So actually, I'm going to call on David. Do you have a response to that?
Well, I think, I don't know if I have a response to it. I have a comment. We'll see. The way you phrased it was as if we didn't live in a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The world I live in is a VUCA world. The model you're talking about is physics or chemistry. They don't deal with that. Maybe subatomic particles, but for the most part, we think of what they find as an eternal verity. Okay, and what we find has a life of a week or a month or a year. And as you go from one district to another, it may not always be there. What it suggests is that in our field, we need modesty about our research and scholarship, because our models are physics and chemistry with generalizability as the goal. And we need to be much more modest. We need to be very modest in our predictions. The one thing we need not be modest in, and should never be modest in, is our moral commitments. And you can be a chemist without a moral commitment, I assume, a physicist without one, but you should never be in the social sciences or education without moral commitments. And that adds complexity to what we do. And I'm glad for that complexity. It keeps us in touch as human beings with the kind of human sciences and not the physical sciences. Anyway, that's what your comments spurred.
Can I
Thanks.
build on that?
Please do, yes.
Again, actually echoing what David just said and what he said in his opening remarks about generalizability and complexity. And I think one of the major disconnects here is that historically, education research, like all research, has been looking for generalizable results. And so that's what we value, that's what we've published. But it's hard to take those generalized results and apply them at a policy level. And I think that if we are trying to think about what should the future of educational research look like, I think that we should be taking context into consideration when we're doing our work, and we should be letting that drive what we value, and so that we can make more applicable, appropriate, aligned conclusions from our work that can be applied to the work that's happening in classrooms or ed policy. But we haven't been, again, speaking very largely, and there's lots of people whose individual work violates what I'm about to say, but as a field, we've been looking again for these generalizable solutions, and we've been valuing those, but that's not what policy needs. That's not what classrooms need. And so we as educational researchers can start to recognize that it's about context and it's about those specifics. Then I think that there's at least a chance that we'll be able to advise on the policy and classroom level work.
Yeah,
If I may add to that, Karen probably knows this as well as I. E.L. Thorndike, who founds educational psychology, told all his graduate students to stay out of classrooms because they're too complex. And all of us have chosen to spend some time in classrooms because they're complex. It's a whole switch in the way we think about what research should be. And
I'd like to jump into on this one, if that's okay. This is good time. I have written policy peoples. I've met with policy groups. I popped one reference into the chat already on that was written for policymakers and teachers in theory into practice on getting evidence-based practices into our schools in writing, with the barriers to doing so are phenomenal. And I can't talk about all of them here, but I want to twist this a little bit and say we do have generalizable principles in education, but they're not generalizable to every student. Most of the things we know about learning and about teaching have to be differentiated, and not differentiated as I'll differentiate it, but differentiated at their core. So one of the reasons that SRSD is so successful is that it is multi-component. It's not hard to learn, but it takes time. And because not all kids, this is my scientific wording, not all kids glom on to the same components. Whereas self-talk is absolutely critical for a large number of kids. It is not for all of them. Other things some kids glom on, and not all, is the tracking of their progress, the goal setting, the self-monitoring. Some kids just take off with that and thrive on it, and it changes their attitudes, motivation. There's so many components, I can't talk about all of them. But part of SRSD in our practice-based professional development, and there's now 21 studies across 3 or 4 countries, teachers are getting just as large effect sizes as researchers, which for decades we've been told cannot happen. Slavin said it couldn't happen. Nonsense. We create these interventions and then say, pick it up here. And unlike Iveta, we go, just drop it there and do it the same way. And that's not working. And so you have to make differentiation to context, current reading and writing curriculum, differentiation to the spread in your classroom, differentiation of goals. And to expect teachers to get every student on grade level, at any grade level, our grade level standards don't allow any spread, And so I get very, very frustrated by all this. one of the big barriers is that evidence-based practices are not yet well respected by policymakers, and it goes to the history David's written about and that others have written about. Like we go on a bandwagon over something and then it doesn't work in schools, or we're too focused on one narrow thing and it's not something that makes enough difference in schools. So I'll just say just that much. But until policymakers think differently about educational research, and they don't require us. How many articles have you read on the only way to talk to policymakers is make no more than 5 points? I've read that in article after article after article. We need to change policymakers. They need to know that not everything is boiled down to 5 points. And furthermore, if you're looking for any evidence-based practice to work as is with every child, that's ridiculous. So we cannot boil it down to do this and all will be well. So that would be my take.
Thanks so much, Karen. So there was a lot that came up in these responses, but I wanted to pick up on a point you made about teachers, Karen, being able to actually, enact these these interventions as successfully as researchers, and tie it back to, there was an early question from a participant about the role. The question really addresses the tensions between, I think, something that came up in a couple comments about the role of educators and teachers versus what we might call a technocentric educational environment, which I think is a trend that we're seeing a lot with artificial tutors, AI, things like that. And the idea that teachers' roles perhaps are, managers or mentors, but perhaps we're leaving out the relationship between teachers and students, and the importance of teachers' pedagogical practices. So I think the question really is, what do you see as our responsibility and role in working with teachers as educational researchers? How does that figure into what we see as the future, with an eye towards ensuring that education is flexible and transformative and responsive to our increasingly complex world?
I think technology can be a part of this, and I don't know where technology might be in 50 years. And we have developed an online platform for teachers where they use different mini lessons, activities. Some are a little bit game-based, things to support the kids who are not getting all the main principles in class. And because all the kids do a couple things online, they get diagnostic and individualized information, but very specific to can do this, can't yet indicate what a transition word is, can't yet generate some transition words. So what we have learned at this state with technology, and I want to talk about A2I real quickly, it's an exception. But at this state with technology, most of it can't lead learning. There's a movie way back where kids are sitting and they're all in these virtual environments and they're talking to this tutor and they're, and it just goes across all. Maybe we'll get there. And for some kids, that could work well right now, but it's not going to work for a lot of kids. And I want to mention A2I really quickly. That's was developed by Carol Connor, and in league with her husband, Jay Connor, they have worked for decades to get it into schools. We lost Carol to cancer last year. We were actually in the same high school class, but didn't know it. Anyway, small world. The point is, A2I is a very sophisticated method that does what we're trying to get started going with our work. It's taken a lot of money and a lot of years, but it still has to be teacher-led. But teachers need all the help and support they can get in identifying, we do a lot through observation. I taught K, I taught fourth grade, I taught adolescents. We do a lot through observation, and we can get a lot through observation and talking with our students. But there's so much more. I would never take the teacher part out of defining who needs what and why. But there's a lot the computer can help with. A2I, the feedback teachers get, the ability to customize lessons, still teacher-led. It's just been wonderful. So I'd say we're headed in ways where technology can make a huge difference, but we're just not there with many products yet.
Thanks, Karen.
Oh, by the way, can I say real quick, Scholastic just bought A2I. Now, this
Oh,
is
wow.
huge because most of us with evidence-based practices cannot get them sold to commercial producers, right? Like I'm on several reading and writing curriculum groups, McGraw-Hill and others, and they want to do EBPs, but they can't because three states control curriculum adoption in this country: California, Texas, and Florida. And what California, Texas, and Florida want in a published curriculum, they get, and the rest of us deal with it. And in writing, for example, they may want 21 forms of writing. I can give you an example in 4th grade. And it's a smorgasbord. No one learns much of anything. So we have got, when we talk about policymakers, it's not just senators and Congress, and it is so far beyond just that, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Karen.
Maybe I can jump in really quickly
Yes,
to
please.
make some connections to, and actually I wanted to link maybe to the earlier policy discussions that we have, and maybe not extend it a little bit more to the knowledge production more broadly. I surely hope that the research and knowledge production is not limited only to academics sitting in universities alone, but this really can happen with multiple people, beings, machines together, so we could learn, the power of collective intelligence that can be brought together somehow. So we had really interesting conversation yesterday with teachers and student activists and artists here in our local community, and students started talking about, and artists, how they feel so excluded from also decision making about their own futures, right? So they were talking about how they want to be at the table in policymakers, right? How they do have valuable perspectives, and it was really interesting and eye-opening to hear actually exactly the same from the teachers, who also said, well, we too feel excluded, right? And we too are not invited into any policy dialogues. We also have no seat at the table. So, but I think if our research also can extend to include students and teachers, AI, I don't know, other beings into the research, doing research together, I think it could be, one way to, broaden our collective intelligence. And another things that we discussed yesterday was, if we are not invited in being at some policy making tables, maybe it's time to create our own tables, right? Or our own spaces for discussion, where we can, begin assembling different actors and stakeholders and bring them into the conversation, and then make the bridges, including to, the current policymakers.
Thanks so much, Iveta. Great points. So we're getting a little short on time. There's still some really provocative questions here. Maybe we'll end with this question from Rebecca, who points out that we have this cycle. We talk about the need for cultural transformation to support quality education for all. Yet, on the other hand, we say we need new forms of education to support cultural transformation. And her question is, are there entry points for changing this cycle? Or are there examples, historical or current exemplars, to help us imagine how we can disrupt this cycle or think about it differently? So this is a challenging one. I see.
Can I quickly maybe
please.
jump in with very quick comments, and then the others can chime in? I think it's such a great question. And I just wanted to make one point, is that, and this was my own frustration with a lot of my own previous research. So much of research focuses on dominant models of education to either help tweak it, to make it better, to basically make best practices better. but on the dominant, maybe critiquing it or improving it. But that when we focus on the dominant practice only, it's so easy then to leave behind and not even see and acknowledge that there is so much happening already in our communities right here, right? And so when it's about the priorities we have also in research and in policymakers, right? So if we can make visible alternative education practices that already exist, I think it would be one of the steps, right? And it could be as close to us as some of the indigenous education practices that may be very relevant to what we are dealing with right now, especially in the context of the Anthropocene, right? Or some of the practices in Southeast Asia or other contexts, right? So it's really interesting what we as research also can do to prioritize what we are examining and what we bring into the conversation and what we make visible. So it's just one answer, but I'm sure there are many other ways to disrupt it. But I think as researchers, we can open the spaces to have these alternatives that already exist to come into view, right? And be part of the conversation and, this imagining.
Thanks,
I would
David.
jump in with one word and then be done. Parents. We wouldn't even have a field of special ed if it hadn't been parents. And I've decided that that's going to be one of my main audiences now. I think you get more change with parents than you do with a lot of policymakers. Done.
Interesting. Great. David, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I'm surprised in this conversation, all of us recognize the power and wonders and magic of teachers and how important they are. Every one of us has said something about classroom teachers, and none of us have said what victims they have become. And it seems to me if we're all going to rely on teachers to carry out the mission, moral and instructive, and we won't pay them, we know who comes into the profession and what's going to happen to it was always a demi-profession, but it looks like it's I don't know, double demi. It's no longer a choice of lots and lots of people who have who would like to be generative in their professional lives, and instead they're being talked out of it, and they won't, and for good reason. And I think unless we all work on that problem as well as everything else we've talked about, we won't have the staff to carry out the kinds of schooling we all envision as better for America. So just a side comment.
Thanks so much, David. Yeah. Ruth, you want to have the last word here? We've got
I feel like what David was saying is how I want us to end. If I could, I think that if we are to think about how can we collectively reach some of the goals that we've shared today, it's when we say we value education, we need to value teachers, and we need to compensate teachers. We need to make it a profession that people are fighting to get in versus fighting to get out. And I think that is such a critical element that all too often, and today too, is almost left out or mentioned as an aside. And I think that needs to be the thing that we are saying first, that if we as a society say we value education, that's not enough. We need to show that we value education. And in our world, that means with money. That's where we are right now. And I think that's just such an important lever of change. And if we can start to move that, and it's not impossible, there are international examples that we can look for that. And I think that's a critical way to not only shape the future of education, but also the future of educational research.
Thanks so much. And just reflecting a comment from Rebecca, one of our participants, in the future, if we do panels like this, we absolutely need to have teachers as well as students as part of the panel to reflect on this topic. So, but thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was a wonderful conversation. I feel like we could go on for yet another hour, but we're at our time limit now. So I'll just thank you. The session is or has been recorded, so we will be posting the recording on our Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College website, so it will be accessible for everyone in the future. And again, thank you so much for your participation. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Take care.
Care.
Bye-bye, folks.